Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Victoria Ransom. Victoria is a serial entrepreneur from New Zealand who has built 3 different companies, the most recent of which is an online learning platform called Prisma. She was listed as one of Fortune's most powerful women entrepreneurs, as well as one of their 40 under 40. And in 2015, she was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. If you enjoy this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Victoria, thanks so much for being on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your remarkable background and your interests and what brought you to working on the problems you're working on?
Sure, yeah. Well, it's a little bit of a long story, but I'll try not to make it too long. So I'm from New Zealand, if you're picking up on an accent, but I've lived in the US for quite a long time now. I have been most of my career a serial entrepreneur, except one small misguided stint into investment banking right out of college. So I've been an entrepreneur. In 2012, my husband and I, we are an entrepreneurial couple, sold a company very successfully to Google. We spent our 3 years at Google, and we told ourselves, whatever we do next, we want it to be something that can have a large positive impact on the world. And then, quite frankly, we spent a good 2 or more years just being so overwhelmed by this desire to have an impact, but not knowing where to start because there's just so many problems that need solving. So we ended up focusing on education, actually for selfish reasons. We have 3 kids. And as the oldest approached school age, we really started to question how we wanted to educate her and the other 2 children. And frankly, just sort of how we wanted their education to fit into our vision for our lives. And this led us down the rabbit hole of sort of learning about all different models of education. We looked at sort of different alternative and independent schools. We looked at micro schools. We looked at homeschooling and actually liked a lot of what we saw. And we started to create sort of a vision for ourselves of our own children's education that would be very much centered around the child, their interests, their pace of learning, that would be very holistic in terms of focusing on, not just academics, but also communication skills and creativity and critical thinking and these things that we hear about a lot, that would be very much tied to the real world. So hopefully kids are never saying, why am I learning this? When will I ever use this? And first and foremost, that would be fun and exciting, because learning is fun and exciting. It is, yeah. And if you start with a foundation of that, then kids can really thrive and achieve their best. So we sort of created a vision for our own lives and our own kids, but got really struck by the idea that there are schools out there that are doing what I just said, that are really child-centric and sort of holistic education, interdisciplinary, but they are so unscalable. It's like, and generally not affordable. There's sort of a really cool little private school here, or maybe a small network of micro schools there, but they're really just not accessing many kids. And so we got sort of fascinated by the idea of, let's not just solve this problem for our own family. Is there a way where we could create a model of education that would sort of meet all those sort of educational values that I just laid out, but that if it works and if families love it and kids thrive, it could be scaled out to large numbers of kids, which is where we got really interested in the idea of, could it be a fully virtual model? And I'll be honest, we went into that with some doubts and, some question marks. Right. And so probably for a good year and a half, we mulled on this idea. We were excited about this idea. We researched this idea, but we didn't pull the trigger. And then in March of 2020, COVID came along.
Right.
And it sort of felt like it threw the whole world of education into disarray. Suddenly everybody was doing education virtually. And we thought, okay, enough sort of ideating and dreaming. Let's just put this to the test and see if it works, see if this is a good way to educate kids. So between March 2020 and September 2020, we had whatever that was, 5 months or so to basically turn a vision into a real operating educational model. We launched with we capped it at 40 kids for our first pilot group. And I guess, to fast forward, and I'm happy to explain more about how the model works, obviously,
Sure.
but it was successful beyond our highest expectations, actually, which is not to say that it's perfect. And I think one of our foundational sort of beliefs is that we should be constantly iterating and improving. But in terms of, number one, the excitement that kids felt for learning, 100% of the kids, because we survey them a lot, said they were more excited about school at Prisma than they were about their previous learning. We had 100% of parents saying they'd recommend Prisma. We've seen pretty phenomenal academic growth, more than 150% growth of expected growth in both math and reading.
What age groups are you working with?
Right. So we are working right now with 4th through 8th grade.
Okay.
Very nice.
Yep. And
do you think it can apply to younger kids as well?
Perhaps. In fact, we have had a couple of 3rd graders in the program because they were siblings, and they were not only academically advanced, that's not even so important, as they were just reasonably mature for their age, I think, in terms of their sort of executive functioning.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a story about my assistant.
Please.
Her son, who's in kindergarten, he was doing virtual school, and she says it caught her totally off guard to find out that, for whatever reason, kindergartners just all of a sudden take their clothes off. And so there's a lot of naked kids on the screen.
Which is problematic, for various reasons.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, we're more interested in going up in the age range into high school than we are focused right now of going younger, because we do think there's probably a limit to sort of the how young you can go and have a fully or largely virtual model that also, there's sort of a large dose of being self-directed and having ownership over your education that's fairly hard to probably expect a 5-year-old to do. So I think the goal is more to go up into high school level than it is to go down. But we have had some 3rd graders that thrived, actually.
That's remarkable. Yeah, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the model a little bit. So you said you surveyed existing approaches to education. I wonder if you found that there were just flaws in each of them that you wanted to correct, or if it was more just adapting an existing way of doing things to a virtual setting.
That's a great question. I mean, certainly if you look at the more traditional model, there were sort of fundamental flaws in our humble opinions.
Right.
I think, education is a very personal topic, and
Right.
I'm not saying that what we believe is for everybody. Is particularly in terms of allowing kids to progress at their own pace and
Right.
providing a more holistic education and letting kids dig into the topics that interest them. I think that's missing. I think there's some sort of innovative small bricks and mortar models that capture quite a lot of what we're doing. So I think there are some models that are quite philosophically aligned. And then I think there's models like Montessori that
Right.
share quite a lot in common with what we're doing. I think we give a level of choice to kids that is pretty unique relative to a lot of schools I've looked at. A lot of schools will have project-based learning, for example, but all the kids are working on the same project. We believe in sort of having a general theme that unites what the kids are working on, but giving them a wide range of choices of projects and even letting them design their own. So we're certainly not a sort of copy and paste of some particular model. It's rather that we're inspired by a bunch of models. But then, we certainly have taken, I think, some of the best practices of alternative, or what people would refer to as progressive education, and adapted them for an online model. And I think the online piece gives a few benefits. One is what I was saying earlier, like the ability to actually scale it if it works. The other thing, though, which I think is becoming increasingly relevant in our world, is flexibility. That increasingly people are working from anywhere they like and are being very flexible in terms of when and how they work. And yet school is the most sort of schedule and geographically rigid
part of life,
construct you can think of. Right. And so not all of our families, but some of our families certainly are really attracted by that freedom. And then the other thing that I think the virtual model is providing that we actually didn't even understand the power of until we did it, is the ability to bring together kids from all different places and all different walks of life. And when you think about traditional schooling, it's the most sort of hyper-local thing you can do. And therefore it can tend to be a little bit in a bubble and a little bit homogenous, because zip codes tend to align around certain socioeconomic groups and probably racial groups and demographics. Yeah. And so our ability to mix kids from currently all over the US and a few countries, we have 5 countries represented, but eventually more, is, I think, a really powerful piece of what we're doing that you can only really do in a virtual format.
So in a virtual setting, a lot of elementary school is considered babysitting, that people want to drop their kids off and so in a virtual setting, you're not dealing with that part of it.
Correct. Yeah. So at the end of the day, a family does need to be able to provide someone to look over their kids. It doesn't have to be, we've created a model that can be very hands-off for parents. So it doesn't have to be a parent that's home with the child, but someone needs to be around. We are experimenting with our first in-person version of Prisma in New Jersey, actually, that we're calling a hub, because it's more like a co-working space than a traditional school setting, where basically kids would still be tuning in to our virtual workshops, and they're still part of a cohort that's based all over the US and even a little all over the world, but they have a place where they can go with other kids. There's a coach on the ground, and they can go every day. They can go some days. So that, I think, as we grow, is something we would love to be able to offer, because it solves for that babysitting or childcare piece.
Yeah.
And it provides for the in-person socialization, which we've actually found, really very meaningful socialization happening at Prisma. But I do think that's quite a big hurdle. It's one of the biggest questions we get from parents.
Yeah. So we play around with these different scenarios, and one of them is how kids get to school. And as we move into the autonomous driverless era, is it okay to put your kid into a driverless car to go to school by themselves? And it becomes such a fascinating question, because you could set it up so that the car recognizes the parent on one end and the teacher on the other end. And then the question becomes, how long is it okay for that kid to be in a car by themselves? Is 10 minutes okay? Is 30 minutes too long? And so this, I think, is going to be kind of a big question coming up over the coming years, because I think it's going to be much more relevant. So is it okay to put your 6-year-old kid in a driverless car to go to school for 30 minutes? I don't know how to answer that.
I mean, I don't know. And I don't know if I want to weigh in, except to say that, 30 years ago, 6-year-olds were probably running around in their neighborhood with a gang of, a bunch of 7 and 8 and 9-year-olds from the neighborhood playing baseball, and the parents let them out the door. And, kids were coping with a level of independence 30 years ago that we do not believe they can cope with nowadays.
Right.
And yet they did cope quite well. And I do think we've maybe crossed the line too much in terms of the level of supervision that we think kids require.
Yeah, I often talk about kids being brought up in a padded rubber room. And it seems that way in some families with the helicopter parents and all that. And
then they're let loose in an adult life that's tricky and full of bumps. So you've been protected, and then here you go.
Yeah. Here's the
How do we
world.
expect kids to be prepared for that?
Right.
What are some of the ways in which Prisma helps with that? You mentioned that socialization is actually something that works pretty well with this model, and that you're also experimenting with moving to some in-person interaction as well. And also, it sounds like there's a lot of independence afforded to the individual students as they sort of choose the educational direction that they want to pursue. So I'm curious as to how you try to foster independence in the students that go through the program.
Yeah, I mean, I think we, in a number of different ways, quite a lot of which is just giving kids control and responsibility over their learning. Now, what the level of responsibility and control we give an eighth grader may well be different than a fourth grader, although some fourth graders are pretty able. And but in terms around, they get choices around a lot of the learning that they're doing, so they're making decisions. They get choices around their schedule. So they'll sit down with their coach and they'll create the schedule that works for them. They set deadlines and goals and things. Again, a coach will support them, but they get to control that. And honestly, if a kid shows up for Expo Day and they haven't prepared and they're sort of on that, we have every 5 weeks, I haven't explained Expo Day, basically every 5 weeks, the kids are presenting to the community the projects they've been working on. So parents and coaches, and sometimes grandparents, sometimes we'll let a kid fumble or even fail because they haven't prepared and they didn't manage their goals and their deadlines well, and next time they do better. So I think inherent in we also have kids when there's parent, coach, child conferences, it is the child that leads that. The learner writes a self-assessment and starts off by saying, this is how I'm really happy about how I did, and this is how I could do better. So there's just quite a lot, built into the model around kids having responsibility, having ownership, having the room to fail. Philosophically, we talk a lot about sort of growth mindset concepts and that sort of thing. The other thing that we really believe in is the idea of each kid reaching their very best. And so there's no concept of grades or A, B, C, D, because, our belief is that obviously kids that don't get good grades, they pretty quickly lose confidence and get disillusioned. But even the kids that are getting straight A's, they're really only learning to do what they need to do to get straight A's. Right. And then they move on to the next thing. So our model is basically you have a mentor coach who knows you very, very well, and they are giving you constant feedback as you're working through a project or through one of your writing missions. They are giving you feedback, having you go back, iterate as you go along. So theoretically, by the time you finish something, it is your best work. And so I think that concept of sort of working hard to achieve your best also really helps kids to sort of feel more responsible and have more ownership over their learning.
I think that's something crucial that's missing from the existing educational models, that you don't have this experience, which you do have, in abundance as an adult, where you turn something in that just doesn't quite make it, and then you just have to keep refining it and hammering away at it, and figuring out what's wrong until it works, right? A lot of actual adulthood is nothing more than that. It can be boiled down to just that process. And it's something that you get almost no exposure to as a high school student or a middle school student. Even a lot of college students manage to get through 4 years without doing very much of that. Right. And so it's really compelling that that's an approach that you're taking. You're trying to build that into the actual educational experience.
I mean, we at Prisma, we call that designer's mindset. And it's one of sort of the key outcomes that we're looking to develop in kids. And it's all about iteration, getting feedback, going back, improving, refining, getting more feedback, which also obviously relates to perseverance and powering through and hearing feedback and that sort of thing. So I spent a lot of time speculating about future of education, and I've kind of settled on this notion of having an AI coach bot that is working with a conversational interface with whoever the student is. And over time, you develop a rapport with this AI coach bot. It becomes your best buddy, and it's constantly in a conversation. It's learning things about you, and you're learning things about it, and it's constantly pushing you into certain directions. Sounds like our coaches.
Yeah, exactly.
Only they're not AI.
But automated. You don't have to pay them.
Automated,
It's just AWS server fees.
Yeah, And while it all sounds really good, the way I think about it, it probably falls apart in actual use. And so, in your way of thinking, how much of the teaching process can get automated?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a great question. I think pieces. So actually, a lot of what the coaches are doing is going through and giving feedback on writing what the kids have written. And I think there's pretty advanced. I forget what the product was called, but I saw a product the other day where you could basically give a sketch of a blog post that you wanted to write, and then it would write it for you. And you could say, I want it for this audience or that audience. And it was outputting something pretty darn good.
Yeah. Is this GPT free?
I think it was based off of that.
Okay.
Yeah. And so the reverse of AI that could go through and at the very least give feedback to kids on sort of the way they've written what they've written. If not, maybe a coach needs to go through and give more feedback on the substance, although I bet AI can get there too. Goal setting is certainly something that we have technology tools to do already. And I bet something that could better coach kids through goal setting and milestones, I bet that could happen. The piece that, and you would know better than me how long it takes for AI to get to this point, but there's such a strong relationship being built between our kids and their mentor coaches, and such a level of trust. And frankly, the kids really want to do their best for their coach. They get to that point where they really they don't want to let their coach down. So I don't know, that piece sounds like it would be pretty hard to replicate. And just the flexibility that a good human coach has to sort of judge where a kid is at and, what direction do we need this one-on-one conversation to go in today, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, when you get into the conversation about scaling, there's a limited number of good coaches for elementary school kids. That's one of the big problems. And so if you can somehow automate that or automate pieces of it anyway, then the potential for scaling improves dramatically.
That's true. And bringing costs down. I mean, I think it's a while before we've struck, we've burned out the pool of good coaches. I mean, what we're finding is we're getting completely overwhelmed with interest for our coaching roles because
that's great.
There are so many wonderful teachers out there, like many. I think there are also many who have sort of been bashing their head against the system and are therefore looking something new. But at some point, that does become a constraint. It also becomes a major cost driver. Right. And we have learned that you need good coaches. Our belief is you need high quality coaches and you need to pay them well. We're not one of these philosophies where sort of quality of teacher, quality of coach doesn't matter.
Yeah. So how many students do you have in the program right now, and how many employees, coaches do you have?
So we're still very small. We capped this year. We said that we wouldn't more than double. We actually did a little bit more than that. I think we're at 87 kids. And that was very deliberate. We're being very careful to grow slowly so we can refine the model, figure out how to scale it while keeping the quality high. And then we put out a wait list. So we have a lot of families on the wait list now. We're going to let more in January, but for now it's still small. So we have 5 coaches and I think it's 87 kids, I think.
Okay.
How do you ensure that certain basic standards are met? So, I assume if you're starting in 4th grade, I believe you said that children are already literate basically and numerate as well. But how do you assess them as they move through? And then how do you make sure that they are able to just do the sorts of things you expect a citizen to be able to do, like familiarity with the times tables and stuff like that? Because it seems like with these open-ended projects, I think they're vastly superior to the way we tend to teach people, but it's entirely possible that certain basic knowledge would never come up in the course of doing a series of these projects. And so I'm just curious as to whether or not you have standards in place or you check for those sorts of things.
No, we do. And we have sort of a way of making sure that our kids are on track relative to where they should be. Everything, we operate with themes. They're 5 weeks long. An example of a theme would be cities of the future, or kids are doing uncharted territories right now, which is looking at space exploration and deep sea exploration. But there's a bunch of STEM learning embedded in that. We've done hidden histories. We've done Inventor Studio. There's going to be an entrepreneurial theme coming up. And so when we design those themes, we're actually laying out pretty clearly what both the academic outcomes are that we're trying to cover, like these particular concepts in science or this particular sort of key learnings from US history, let's say, and also the more holistic outcomes, like we're really focusing on communication skills in this particular theme, or this theme is going to be super heavy on collaboration and teamwork and or creativity, or so as we design the projects, although there's a lot of choice, each of them we make sure that they hit those key outcomes. But on top of that, we actually it is hard to get through all the core content in math whilst only, at least in our opinion, whilst only doing projects. So we do have what are called math missions that the kids are working on in addition to their projects. And basically they are a mixture of our own content and our own sort of problems, some adaptive learning apps, because it's fantastic that you can have kids work through an app and it gets harder as they answer correctly. But one of the downsides of that is you don't see how a kid is arriving at their answers, and you don't know if they're really truly understanding. So we mix sort of our own problems and content with adaptive apps with, we always also have an element of the math missions where the kids are taking what they're learning and applying it in a real world sort of situation. So math is something we sort of have additional curriculum for, and writing too. So although tons of writing is happening in the projects, we also have writing missions where kids might be they might be focused on argumentative writing, and they're doing, it includes some grammar practice and some sort of foundational, and then some practice writing small argumentative pieces and then a longer piece. So yeah, I mean, we believe strongly that for kids to be prepared for their next stage of education, high school, or if they chose to leave Prisma earlier, they should be excellent writers across all different sort of genres of writing. They should love reading. So we actually have book clubs as well that we do alongside with the curriculum I just mentioned. And they should be at or above grade level in math. For subjects like science or social studies, we are less focused on sort of, here's all the different, content that they need to cover in social studies. It's much more sort of history. What are the key learnings of history? Why should you care about history? What is a primary source? What is a secondary source? How can you apply history to today? Similar with science, it's more, why is science important for our world? What is the scientific method? How can you read a research study? That sort of thing. We do, coming back to my point about making sure kids are on track, in addition to sort of the our own assessments that we're doing, we actually do it's called MAP. It's like a nationally recognized assessment. It's not timed, so there's no time pressure, but in math and reading to make sure that kids are on track with their peers. And we've actually last year, we did that at the end of the year, and our kids were 54% of expected growth in math and 173% of expected growth in reading. So that was kind of exciting because mostly we were focusing on, it was very exciting, that they love learning and they're developing these holistic skills, but they were clearly also learning the foundational academic skills as well.
Yeah. So a lot of, I've often said this, that we're training our kids to think two-dimensionally. We have two-dimensional whiteboards, blackboards, even the screen on our computer is two-dimensional, or two-dimensional books and paper. And so as we move into extended reality, we move into three-dimensional spaces, we're not good at thinking three-dimensionally ourselves. And so the idea of teaching kids to think three-dimensionally, I think is really a missing element in all of this. And so as we move into this metaverse thinking, that we're going to have some ability to think three-dimensional, because we're not just viewing something, we're actually immersing ourselves in things. And have you given much thought to that?
I think the way that we've thought about that is how amazing it would be if one day, and I don't see why this won't be the case, our Prisma workshops and our Prisma stand-ups and our Prisma clubs were happening through virtual reality, where kids can actually, it's pretty engaging right now, and kids really are engaged and they really are forming friendships. But imagine if all of that were happening through virtual reality in a way that feels even more real and personal and sort of tangible. So we've talked about it to that extent. What I'll throw it back on you. What do you think it takes to get kids or people to think more three-dimensionally?
Well, I think if you're restricted by having to put on a VR helmet, I think that's a non-starter.
Okay.
Because if as an example, you had your football game broadcast in VR, and you had to put the helmet on, and you could immerse yourself in each of the players because they have cameras on the helmets, and you could feel what it'd be like to be on the field. That would be really cool. But as soon as you put the VR helmet on, then suddenly it takes you out of the room. Suddenly you're outside of the conversations that are happening there. You forgot where you put your pizza or your beer, and suddenly you feel like you're an outsider suddenly. So then and nobody's going to be wearing a VR helmet for 4 or 5 hours at a time.
Yeah. I mean, the way it is today
we're kind of waiting for the hardware to catch up with what needs to happen.
Yeah, not to mention the costs, because layering that kind of cost onto our model would not work. But presumably we're going to get to the point, I think we're already on that track of getting smaller and smaller and cheaper and cheaper. So
not to be the Luddite futurist on the Futurati podcast, but we shouldn't overlook just the value that comes with doing things actually in the world. Turns out the world is three-dimensional. Like we don't
actually, that's a great point.
We don't need to wait for the hardware and virtual reality to catch up. I think that it's a travesty that kids don't get as much exposure to just building things or repairing things or making things.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
It's much richer cognitively than I think a lot of people appreciate. And we do students a disservice by never letting them explore those things. And I mean, it's not just that, but martial arts or dance or other sorts of spatially extended activities are all things that can kind of foster that sort of thinking that's missing when we're staring at screens all day.
So that's a really good point, and you're right, that is, very three-dimensional, and it is actually something we very actively build into our curriculum, partly because we think it's really valuable, and partly because I think for parents, making sure that kids get time away from the screen is really important. Right. So we do that with projects. Many of our project options that kids can choose from have an outcome that can be expressed through physical materials. Like there was a project in Cities of the Future where you designed your own environmentally friendly building, and then you could create that with real materials. Or some kids chose to do it on Minecraft or other mediums. But we had a really fun STEM workshop where basically at the beginning of each workshop, the coach introduced sort of a key invention and inventor that the kids had probably never heard of, like the suspension bridge. Right. And then in the course of that workshop, they were asked to bring, along sort of a collection of household materials. They had certain parameters where they had to recreate, let's say, a bridge that could hold this much of a weight, and it had these shapes in it, et cetera, et cetera. And then they talked about the key sort of physics behind it. But, it was a virtual workshop, but the kids were physically building things with their hands. So, kids really like that. They get, not only is it good learning, but kids get excited about being able to do that sort of stuff.
I'm curious as to what your accreditation status is. Have you faced any hurdles with state governments or the federal government with respect to what you're teaching children, whether or not they're hitting their benchmarks, that kind of thing?
Yeah, we have not, and we're not currently accredited. And in fact, it's not something that parents are asking for, but I think as we move into high school, that's going to become important. So it's something that we're focused on at that level. Actually, Prisma today is a very comprehensive program for homeschool families. So all of our families are actually registered as homeschool families, and we are providing sort of the overlay to that in terms of the curriculum and the coaches. So at the end of the day, parents, as they always do, I think, have the final say on their kids' education. So no, we've not faced any hurdles, but I think as we move up into those upper grades, as parents focus more on high school, accreditation becomes more important. And so that is, I think, a hurdle we're going to have
when they're thinking about college.
Yeah. So as you're envisioning the future of Prisma, what are you envisioning 10 years from now? How big is your school? How many people do you employ? What grades do you cover? Have you given a lot of thought to the dimensions that you're going to try to cover?
Yeah, I mean, not in terms of, I'll say we're going to have, this many kids. I think we will be 10 years from now, we would hope to be, easily in the tens of thousands of kids. And that will depend on how good we are at maintaining our quality while we scale, right, which to your point comes back to how great we are at hiring and training. And so I think growth, TBD on how fast we can grow, because we will not sacrifice quality for growth. We can be patient in terms of getting big, but we do believe we can get to tens and then hundreds of thousands of kids and beyond. Okay. We'll be offering high school by that point. I think it's, we talked about that earlier, whether we go below sort of third or fourth. I think there are ways we could, but I think that would be the last frontier in terms of the age range. And we would at that point, we will be a global network. We have this vision of that you get sort of the intimacy and the support of the one room schoolhouse. And that is our sort of small cohorts of kids and coaches that you get to know really well, while being sort of having the breadth of opportunity and diversity that can come with the largest educational network in the world. So imagine that you've got these sort of smaller cohorts, part of a really large educational network from kids all over the world. And those kids can be part of clubs together and they can be interacting with each other in different ways, but they're not lost in this sort of huge organization of thousands of kids. So yeah, I think that we will be excited when we can really have that global breadth and be reaching large numbers of kids.
So is this a business you hope to scale up and sell to Google as well, or
the other Google minds?
No. I mean, coming back to what we said earlier, that when we left Google, we said what we want to do next is have a large positive impact on the world.
Okay.
So we have no focus on exits. I don't know what that would look like, actually. And we really are working very carefully to be a mission-first organization. So yes, we believe in having a business model so that we don't have to go out and sort of raise philanthropic funds, that we can be self-supporting and we can grow the business through the business model, but we're not focused on maximizing profits. I think wherever educational organizations have tried to maximize profits, I can't think of many where that's really, hasn't caused a real clash of interests between sort of shareholders and what's best for kids.
Yeah. So do you have any franchise model for parents that want to stand these things up themselves?
Yeah. No. I have talked to a few families that are interested in that kind of thing. I think around these pods that I mentioned, the in-person sort of hubs, that there could be something interesting there. But again, that's an area where we want to be really careful and thoughtful, because there are some really great models out there that are being franchised. But I think the problem is that they're only as good as the franchisee. And so you end up with a situation where maybe the original school is amazing and some of the franchises are amazing, but others have really sort of, lost the quality. So I think there may be room for that, but in a more centralized way than I've seen it done so far, in terms of making sure that kids are still a part of the broader network, tuning into our workshops, that there's still a really, really high bar for coaches. But today, no. The short answer is not yet.
There's a lot of emerging EdTech technology coming out. And how much are you experimenting with some of the new stuff that's coming out of the woodwork?
Yeah, I think where we are using EdTech is with sort of using adaptive apps as part of our curriculum. Well, that's one way. So I think we've used and are using and always looking for more interesting ways that kids can be using adaptive apps to be building their math skills or grammar or coding. And then the other is there's lots of interesting tools out there for sort of collaboration among kids, for kids to showcase what they've created. So we do use quite a few different tools as part of Prisma. So I guess yes, but I bet there's a lot out there that we're not using yet that we probably could.
Yeah. I wonder if you might just sort of put your, futurist goggles or whatever on. I don't know if you got your futurist goggles in the mail. We tried to overnight them, but you spent a lot of time thinking about education, different educational models. You're actually in a startup that's focused on the educational space. And do you have any broader thoughts about the long-term trends in education? I mean, digitization is kind of an obvious one, especially with COVID sort of pumping the gas on that. But there are others, presumably, that you could weigh in on. What are your just broad thoughts?
I mean, I feel like there's a emergent, just beginning sort of trend of bypassing college, basically. That currently college is the absolute gatekeeper for work. And increasingly so, it's like now an undergraduate degree is not enough, so you need a master's, and that's not enough. And I do think that greatly affects what comes below it in K-12 education, parents' willingness to experiment with education. I think it's just emergent, but you start to see whether it's Lambda or different programs where people can create great careers while bypassing college. And I think that trend is going to continue. And I think as that continues, that will have flow-on effects for what you see in K-12. So I think that's one trend. I think another trend that we're banking on is just that there'll be more and more interest in really flexible forms of education, where families can live where they wish, and whether it's fully virtual like ours or sort of a hybrid between virtual and in-person like our hub model. I think, our belief is that trend will continue. And it's interesting, the majority of families that are part of Prisma are not families that were homeschoolers before, or that were even doing alternative forms of education before. They were families that discovered during COVID, when their kids were at home, that for one reason or another, that model of home-based virtual education actually worked better for their kids. In some cases, it's because it worked really well for the family and their lifestyle. In some cases, it's because kids were able to just move forward faster than they were before. In other cases, it's because they had whether physical or other needs that make it hard for them to, show up in a classroom, sit in a classroom. But so I think that particular trend of families realizing there's a whole different way that we could educate our kids, not just in terms of curriculum or pedagogy, but model. I mean, we think that's going to continue. We've seen a ton of interest.
So the work from home model, the number that I heard is it's given these workers an additional, on average, 28 days a year that they can do something with. So by not commuting, that frees up a tremendous amount of their time, which 28 days is staggering. And so what can you do with that? But I always think about so much of college education is based on this just in case thinking. We need to teach you all this stuff just in case you might run into it sometime in the future. And that's a really poor fit for the business world, where everything is oriented around just in time. We need you to learn this because we're going to apply it tomorrow. And so thinking in terms of how to orient people around that, I've been focused on this AI coach bot or assessment bot, and the average person is learning, is actually consuming information over a little over 12 hours every day. And some of it's just music, some of it's watching television, some of it's on a computer. It's coming in lots of different forms, but we're not getting credit for any of the things that that learning that's happening ambiently. Has any of this kind of factored into your thinking as you start growing these students older and older?
I mean, a few things you're saying kind of resonate. I mean, we haven't thought in terms of how does Prisma contribute to the lifelong learning of kids beyond Prisma. We haven't got that far yet, except to say that, you know, one of our highest and greatest priorities is that kids nurture and grow their curiosity, because if you're curious, you can be a lifelong learner. Right. If you're a lifelong learner, you can change careers, reinvent yourself many times, which I think is precisely what most people are going to have to do in the future. It's already happening. But I think the other thing that you're hitting on that resonates is this idea. So I said it a little bit before, like we don't have this checklist of this is the content you need to learn in science, because if you decide to be a chemist or a physicist, you can learn the deep content that you will need to be a physicist later. What we care more about is that, first of all, you get exposure to science to see if that's something you are passionate about, that you understand its importance in the world, that you understand how to recognize a well-done scientific study and one that isn't well done, and sort of that, or similarly with something like history. It's the lessons of history that we think are much more important than covering particular periods. So I think that idea of let's give kids the tools to teach themselves anything later, rather than, to your point, teach them this just in case, teach them this just in case they become a mathematician, teach them this just in case they become a historian. Yeah, that just ends up with a bunch of kids learning stuff that they weren't that excited about, that they'll never use. And my own career, I studied psychology in Spanish in college, and then my first job out of college was investment banking. I knew nothing about finance and business, but the job trained me for the first 5 weeks that I was there, and I was good to go. So what mattered was my foundational skills. I could write, I could communicate, I could think critically, I had a good work ethic. So yeah, we think much more along those lines, I think.
It seems like a pivot away from a breadth-first approach where you just try to cover the broad swaths of history or the broad swaths of mathematics, and instead of like an iterative depth approach where you sort of dive down into things that are interesting to you, and as long as you're hitting certain high-level concepts that are just sort of important generally, then that is a perfectly serviceable vehicle for achieving an education.
I mean, I'd rather you did a couple of things related to history in your education and you loved it and you got really deep and super excited about it, than cover the breadth of history. Even if you miss some really key parts, then you cover the breadth, but you really hate it. You don't see the point of it. And for me, at least, how I've learned about history, I don't think it was through school. It was, I get interested in something and then I'll read about it. So you want people that are going to go and get interested and learn about something, because you can't naturally, choices are made about what you cover in any different subject area anyway. It's not like I covered all of history in my education, and you can't. So yeah.
So it's always occurred to me that going to college, what you produce while you're in college, there's nothing terribly meaningful that comes out of your college courses. It's not, none of these papers you've written or any of the work you've done you want to show to your friends and say, hey, look at this. Right. And so we were playing around with this idea of accomplishment-based education. And again, this idea of an AI coach bot that is coaching you. And if, as an example, you wanted to write a book that could coach you through all of the steps on how to create an outline and how to create a story arc and do character development and all of that to write a book. And then by the time you're done, you have something that's meaningful, something that's an actual accomplishment. And it's the same thing if you're a game designer, take you through all the steps, or if you wanted to be an inventor, or if you wanted to just become an expert on some topic, having a coach bot that's coaching you through all of the steps, that seems like you would end up with things that are much more meaningful, kind of turning points in your life, as opposed to just do this paper and it has to be 12 pages and it has to be in double spaced and you can't spell any words wrong.
And frankly, if I was a college admissions officer or someone hiring in a company or any organization, I think, be much more excited about someone that had really achieved something they had to work at for a long time. And they put a lot of sweat and passion into it. And frankly, so we have that concept, we call it journeys at Prisma. It is optional, but it's basically for kids that want to go really deep on something. They do it, for much more than a cycle. They could do it for a year. They could do it for more than a year if they want. I mean, AI bot would be really handy to help coach those kids. So I want to hear, as you evolve this concept, right now we're just putting sort of scaffolding in for the kids, and we're allowing them to showcase their progress. And we have a human coach that helps encourage them. But, we have one kid that's working on writing a novel, and he's 5th grade. But it's kind of amazing what he's done already. And we feel as you go into high school, there's even much more opportunity for that, for kids to really dive deep and create very meaningful, whether they're starting a business or whether they're coding something really amazing or writing something really amazing. And, I think that would be another hope for how education changes, that the college system might start to really recognize those kind of achievements more than they do the sort of check the box, right, SAT, sort of, APs, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So one of the things that Prisma aims to achieve with its students is preparing them for the jobs of the future. And we have kind of circled this question all throughout the conversation. So I thought just in the closing minutes, if you wanted to riff on that a little bit and talk about what you think the jobs of the future will be and how it is that this model is better suited to producing people that will be able to tackle those.
Sure. Well, actually, I think, our main sort of philosophy or thesis there is that it's hard to know what the jobs of the future will be. And so mostly what we're wanting to do is prepare kids who could be ready for whatever those jobs end up being. I mean, again, I'm talking to people that know a lot about this topic, but studies I've read have said that today's elementary school kids, 65% of them will work in jobs that haven't even been invented. So how do you prepare kids for a job that hasn't even been invented? That's where it comes back to really providing sort of those fundamental skills and mindsets that are sort of quintessentially human, that will enable people to really be attractive for a whole range of jobs. So it's things like collaboration and just generally your interpersonal skills and your communication skills, critical thinking, sort of executive functioning. Right. So really trying to develop that. And then the other thing that we care greatly about is kids that can be adaptable and persevere in the face of change and challenges, which I think we build through the fact that kids are required to have a lot of ownership over what they're doing. Because the other sort of thesis we have is that people will have to reinvent themselves. Well, they already are. So many people are having to hustle to make a living, and they're sort of being really entrepreneurial, and they have different careers throughout their lifetimes. I think that's going to continue and accelerate. And so kids that are comfortable with the idea of that, comfortable of adapting and changing is, so it's a mindset thing, and it's a sort of developing those general skills. I think to some extent, college, as you were just describing, starts to develop some of those skills, but it's late at that point to start to develop your independence and your perseverance. And so why not do it earlier?
Yeah. So how do you hit that brick wall at 60 miles an hour and then just pick yourself up and start over again? Yeah. That idea of teaching resilience and teaching that ability to grasp onto whatever you have left and make something out of that. A lot of what I've talked about in the past has to do with the idea that it's the same technologies that are automating jobs out of existence is the same technology that's going to be creating the businesses and industries of the future. And so we tend to shy away from the things that are taking our jobs that are putting us out of work and stuff, but we should actually learn how to embrace them. We should learn how to adapt to them.
I've often thought that, if AI can start to do some of the more mundane things, or no, not even mundane, I think that's probably the wrong word, but if we could free doctors up so they could spend far more time with their patients instead of rushing them through the office, because there's a huge psychological component to medicine. If you could free teachers up so they could spend far more time with their kids instead of doing all the grading and administrative work, and that there were more teachers available for having lower ratios. I mean, there's some amazing human things that I think the world really needs that we may have more time for in the future if we can take away some of the other responsibilities that people have.
Yeah, one of the questions I ask a lot is, how many Einsteins and Mozarts are born in every million people, and can there be more, and should there be more? And I think it's a real interesting, probing question.
In other words, there ought to be more, but we're just not cultivating them.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I certainly know that many people's potential is thwarted at a young age. I think partially through just sheer lack of opportunity. If you end up in a really poor school district in the wrong zip code, then your chances of getting a great education and really being able to shine in life become much slimmer. But even aside from that, how many kids just lose their confidence in themselves throughout the school? And how do you pick yourself up from that to become Mozart? I mean, that's, I think it's a rare spirit that can go from feeling like you're not good at things to really achieving your best. And so, another thing that education should really do is uplift kids and make them feel like they're really capable of achieving their best. And I don't think that it does that for a lot of kids.
Yeah. One of the thoughts I had when we were talking about, hitting the brick wall when you go to college and being able to pick up the pieces and make something of it is that it actually does a disservice disproportionately, I would think, to some of the best and brightest kids who, coasted through middle school and high school, who never really had to work all that hard, but who got to college or maybe their first job. And it's like, holy shit, I don't already know all the answers. And it's not a matter of memorizing what I'm supposed to regurgitate on the test. It's a matter of like iterating over projects and taking negative feedback and kind of dealing with that, just staring into the abyss and chewing on glass, to use a famous phrase. And so possibly one way of upping the ratio of Mozarts and Einsteins per million people is teaching resilience earlier in life, using a model similar to what Prisma is trying to do.
Yeah, give them glass for lunch.
Yeah, exactly. The glass chewing module, one of the less popular Prisma offerings.
And coming back to what you said about giving people and kids the freedom to go deep on something. I mean, that's another challenge with the educational model. We've got, there's testing, and therefore there's a certain amount of content that the teacher needs to get through to be ready for the test. And so if you sense that a kid or a group of kids are really excited about something, there's no time to stop and go deep into that. So the idea of giving kids space, which I actually think is something that homeschoolers in general are really pretty good at, because I think homeschooling can be very efficient in terms of getting through what you need to do. Right. So there's a bunch of room left for kids to tinker on projects and dig deep into things that, unfortunately, if you're 6 hours in school and then you have a bunch of homework at night, you don't have, and then a whole bunch of extracurriculars, you don't have time to do.
Yeah, we live in a very distracted society. I mean, everywhere you look, you have distractions, lights going on, buzzers going off, and all kinds of noises and things going off. And so this distracted society is making us so that we're much more shallow than we were in the past.
I've been live tweeting this whole time. This entire conversation.
But you see that a lot, some of the most successful people are people that take time out to walk in the woods or meditate and I definitely, that's actually I love remote work. It was what we always intended for our next organization. But I must say, one of the things I miss a little bit from commuting is that commuting is like a forced time to just, particularly if you're not on the phone, to sit and ruminate. And actually, when I'm just walking from my house to the garage, and then because I'm in the garage right now, and then back, we have an office in the garage, back to the kids, and there is very little time for that sort of letting your mind wander.
Yeah, but if you're caught in rush hour traffic and you're commuting,
yeah, that's true.
A lot of time to ruminate very
Totally
slowly.
true.
Yeah, you're pretty much raising your fist and cussing at the other guy.
That's true. And you're late for work and you're stressed about it. Self-driving cars could help with that. More relaxed as
to come full circle with where we started the conversation.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, fantastic. This has been a remarkable conversation. We've really enjoyed talking to you about this project, and we wish you all the best. Do you have any closing thoughts for us?
Oh, keep me posted on your AI coach.
Okay.
I'm keen to hear that, guys.
We will definitely do that. Some good projects happening very close to you there.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on some areas where we're going to have to figure out if we really want to scale, to the proportions that we want to get to, then we're going to have to look for a technology.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. We'll keep you posted on that. We're actually working with some companies in a sort of advisory capacity and helping them polish their offerings, but there are people kind of working directly on this, and who knows, maybe there's room for fruitful collaboration there.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Interesting conversation. I enjoyed it.
Very good.
All right. Bye-bye.